Okay, continuing our quotes from just in general on the fossil evidence for transition of all life forms. Tom Kemp, again an evolutionist, curator of the University Museum at Oxford University, said, as is now well known, most fossil species appear instantaneously in the fossil record. Frances Hitching from the Royal Institute of Archaeology, in her book, The Neck of the Giraffe, or Where Darwin Went Wrong, said, the curious thing is that there is a consistency about the fossil gaps. The fossils are missing in all the important places. Oh. By the way, I said her. How do you spell Frances if it's a woman? I-S or E-S? E. If it's I-S, it's a man? Okay, this is a man. I'm sorry. I've always confused those names. I don't think any man should be called Francis because it's too confusing. But it's a man then. This man, Francis. Okay. Next is Mark Ridley, who is professor of zoology at Oxford University, who wrote an article in New Scientist magazine called Who Doubts Evolution? He says, in any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, I'll explain that in a moment, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Now he's underlined no real evolutionist. In other words, what he's saying is those that are really serious, not your school teachers with the textbooks, but the really serious evolutionists who really know the facts. In other words, he's saying they wouldn't dare use the fossil record as evidence to try to support evolution over special creation. Because, in fact, the fossil record looks like it was all by special creation. There's nothing about it that really looks, except to the uninformed, that looks evolutionary. Okay, John Adler, in an article called Is Man a Subtle Accident? In Newsweek magazine, said this: the more scientists have searched for the transitional forms that lie between species, the more they have been frustrated. Stephen Gould, the evolutionists have quoted it before, and he's the one who earlier admitted that, the slow, gradual evolution that's not supported by the fossil record. And you said, well, what do they believe? Okay, I didn't comment up here in this other quote when they said whether no real evolutionist, whether a gradualist or a punctuationist. Okay, the gradualists are the traditional evolutionists who said it's all happened slowly and gradually over millions and hundreds of millions and billions of years. Slow, gradual steps and slow change. Well, that is completely belied by the fossil record. There's simply no transitions when the fossil record should be full of transitions, way more transitions than the final forms. So there are those who've come along now that have, it goes by various names, but the punctuationists are those who believe now, in order to try to maintain evolution, but to explain why it's not in the fossil record, they believe that it's happened suddenly and quickly. That is, all of a sudden, life just goes along, and here's this creature, and it doesn't change much, and all of a sudden, something happens to very rapidly in a short period of time. And for them, that might be, some numbers of years, maybe even hundreds of years. When you're talking about millions of years, hundreds of years is nothing, right? That in a short period of time, it suddenly evolved from one form into another form, and then finished evolving in such a short period of time that it either didn't get caught on the fossil record because of its short time frame, or if it's been caught, it's just a small part of the total fossil record that just hasn't been discovered yet. So, what?
Sudden burst.
A sudden burst of evolutionary force that brings about these supposed changes. So that's what guys like Gould believe. Anyway, he wrote an article in Natural History magazine called The Return of Hopeful Monsters. That's what they call these creatures that suddenly just, boom, they just evolve in a real short period of time, and bang, there it is, hopeful monsters. And he says, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt.
Those must be pockets of neg entropy.
Yeah, pockets of neg entropy, yeah.
And they call them hopeful because it's wishful thinking?
Yeah.
Can they call it that, though?
Well, it's been labeled that. I'm not sure whether they're kind of joking about their own views in coming up with these things, or whether somebody else has labeled it that, I'm not sure, but they have come to be called hopeful monsters.
But they have no evidence that would even support that.
No, they believe evolution's true. Remember the quotes from earlier from guys like what's his name? What? No, the Huxley, who said, you see, we know it's impossible, but it has happened. So they start with that premise. It's just like this when we talked about geocentricity versus heliocentricity. Everybody knows that the Earth is going around the sun, right? Every year. Everybody knows that we're rotating in our axis. Therefore, anything they see that would suggest otherwise, they throw out the evidence, say there's something wrong with the experiment, because they know that it's not that way. They know that we are going around the sun and that we are rotating on our axis. Well, they don't know that at all, but they believe it so thoroughly, they take that to be the absolute fact. And so they're looking for evidence to support something they're supposing to be true. Well, that's the same way with this. They believe in evolution. Therefore, since the fossil record doesn't support the old theory of gradualism, of this slow, gradual, uniformitarian, eons of time gradual process and change, therefore, since they believe evolution to be true, it must have happened quickly, in bursts that didn't get recorded. So even though there's no evidence to support that, their evidence to support it is their belief in evolution to begin with. That's it. The best I can do on defending their reasoning. Here's another quote from Stephen Gould in an article called "Is a New and General Theory of Evolution Emerging?" from a magazine called Paleobiology. He said, "The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for the gradualist accounts of evolution." You got that? He's even saying we have trouble even imagining transitions. They're having trouble even dreaming them up, let alone finding them. So even though he is still an absolute evolutionist, he is at least saying, hey, the way we've always viewed this thing, the long, gradual, slow process, can't be. The evidence is too strong against it. Stephen Stanley, an evolutionist, wrote a book called Macroevolution, Pattern and Process. 1979, he said this: "The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphologic transition." Morphologic would be in how the creature appears. Phyletic refers to the line of descent. So the known fossil record fails to document a single example of line of descent evolution accomplishing a major physical observable change and transition. David Rupp, we quoted him earlier. Again, he is the curator of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. In an article called Conflicts Between Darwin and Paleontology, said this: "Most people assume that fossils provide a very important part of the general argument made in favor of Darwinian interpretations of the history of life. Unfortunately, this is not strictly true." What's not strictly true? People believing and assuming that the fossils provide a very important part of the general argument in favor of Darwinian evolution. It's not strictly true. Okay, Gould again, in another article he wrote called Evolution's Erratic Pace, Natural History magazine, said the family trees which adorn our textbooks, family trees when they show all these creatures, in a tree-like structure, showing the lines of descent. He says the family trees which adorn our textbooks are based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. In other words, they have their evolutionary theory, they draw their pictures. There's no fossil evidence to support the pictures. David B. Kitts, Ph.D. in zoology, well-known evolutionary paleontologist, head curator of the Department of Geology at the Stovall Museum, said this in an article, I guess it's a book called Evolution. Well, maybe it's a magazine. It's volume 128. That must be a magazine. Yeah. The article is called Paleontology and Evolutionary Theory. By the way, the reason when I give the names of these people, I give, who they are and what they are, so you appreciate these are not just some little classroom science teacher out there making these statements. These are people who know. These are people who have to face the inadequacies of the evidence all the time when they're trying to hold their theory together. He says, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides us a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists. Remember, paleontology is the study of fossils. And they presumed, based on their belief in evolution, that when they started digging around the fossils, they were going to find all this evidence to support it. But he's saying not only has it not supported it, but it's presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists. The most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. Here's a quote now from G.S. Carter, who is an evolutionist author and a professor and a fellow of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, England. He said this, "It must also be remembered that we never have available for our discussions the actual forms from which a later group evolved. For, as we have seen, we never find among the fossils a record of the exact point of divergence from one group to another." But you look in the books, they got all these exact points of divergence for each creature as it evolves from lower to higher forms, supposedly. But he's saying we don't actually have any of that. He says many of the forms that would be of the greatest interest to us are missing. In particular, we have no direct fossil evidence of the steps in these early stages of vertebrate evolution by which any of the major groups arose from earlier forms.
You can understand why they're frustrated, because they've created so much time to make everything.
Yep. Yeah, they come up with their alleged great eons of time to do it all, and yet there's no evidence exactly where they think they ought to find the evidence. Indeed, according to their theory, the evidence ought to be there if their theory is true.
And it's not like they're not finding any bones at all.
Oh, they're finding lots of bones.
Right.
In fact, I got some quotes on that in a minute that'll show you what kind of material they have to work with. Here's a quote again from George Gaylord Simpson in a book called The Major Features of Evolution, in which he said, "It remains true, as every paleontologist knows, that most new species, genera, and families, and that nearly all categories above the level of families, appear in the fossil record suddenly and are not led up to by gradual, completely continuous transitional sequences." How come these kind of things are not in the biology textbooks in schools, where the kids are being taught evolution as a fact? Never do you see a quote like that in those textbooks. Darwin himself, who really kind of started the modern-day evolutionary belief system back in the 1800s, published his book in 1859, I believe it was. Darwin said that the world's fossils, he admitted, provided perhaps the most serious objection that one could raise against his theory. In his book, he has a section about possible objections to his theory, and he admits in there that the fossils are a problem. Okay? He said this, but as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, in other words, according to the theory, there must be innumerable transitional forms, he says, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? He says, but just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, that is, the fossil record is an enormous evidence of death, extermination of creatures, so must the numbers of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth be truly enormous. In other words, we have this tremendous quantity of fossil evidence of the final forms. We should have an even greater enormous amount of transitional forms. Why then is not every geologic formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection that can be urged against my theory of evolution. But you remember, he wrote that in 1859, okay, when they hadn't found yet that many fossils. though at the time they found plenty of fossils, enough for him to say, hey, there could be a problem here. But he went on to indicate that he believed that eventually, as more fossils were found, they'd finally find those transitional forms. Because again, he still believed in his theory. However, since Darwin's time, millions, and that's probably, to even say millions is a misstatement on the low side, millions have been spent by museums, universities, and governments and individual researchers to find evidence for evolution in the fossil record. Tons and tons of new fossils have been unearthed and closely examined, and there's no longer any lack of fossil evidence, as one could have argued over 100 years ago at Darwin's time. In fact, for some time now, there's been so many specimens that the science and museums can't handle it all. In other words, there's way more than they can handle and process. Evolutionist Neville George, in an article called Fossils: An Evolutionary Perspective from Science Progress magazine, said, "There's no need to apologize any longer for the poverty of the fossil record. In some ways, it has become almost unimaginably rich." They used to actually argue, well, we just haven't had time to find enough fossils yet to prove the point. But now they're admitting that the fossil evidence is so abundant and so much has been found that it's hard to argue that anymore. So they've been totally disappointed to find, in trying to find evidence in the fossil record that it's the same today as it was in Darwin's day. Nothing's changed. Not one thing has changed with all the fossils they found. There's still no proof. In fact, to the contrary, a reasonable interpretation of the evidence is that the life forms as seen in the fossil record are simply as they were created. We quoted David Ropp before, who again is the curator of Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. He wrote in an article called Conflicts Between Darwin and Paleontology. He wrote this: "Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record. We are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species." In other words, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of fossils that they actually have, but there's 250,000 different species that they've found in fossil form. But the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we did in Darwin's time. In other words, the evidence indicates since then that even what they thought might be transitions back at Darwin's time aren't.
Do creationists have any idea of the number of species that God created?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a minute. I got a quote from an evolutionist who admits the number of life forms we're talking about here, and it's very interesting. Here's a quote from from creation evolution researcher Luther Sunderland. He said, "Now after 120 years, the most extensive and painstaking geological exploration of every continent and ocean bottom, the picture is infinitely more vivid and complete than it was in 1859 at the time of Darwin. Formations have been discovered containing hundreds of billions of fossils, and our museums are now filled with over 100 million fossils of 250,000, that's 250,000 different species. The availability of this profusion of hard scientific data should permit objective investigators to determine if Darwin was on the right track. What is the picture which the fossils have given us? The gaps between major groups of organisms have been growing even wider and more undeniable. They can no longer be ignored or rationalized away with appeals to the imperfection of the fossil record." Imperfection of the fossil record meaning, well, we only got bits and pieces of it. Now they've got so much of it, it's complete. Like that other guy we quoted, the evolutionist, says, they're going to keep on, they're never going to fill those voids. We've got enough now, we know they're not going to fill the gaps. Here's Colin Peterson again, the evolutionist, who says, again, he is the senior paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History in London. He says, all one can learn about the history of life is learned from systematics, from groupings one finds in nature. The rest of it is storytelling of one sort or another. We have access to the tips of a tree. The tree itself is theory. In other words, the tips of the tree, that's all those final forms. Everything else underneath it in the tree, the evolutionary tree, he says, is strictly theory. And people who pretend to know about the tree and to describe what went on with it, I think, are telling stories. This is an evolutionist that says that. Another evolutionist, Dr. Edmund J. Ambrose, Emeritus Professor of Cell Biology at the University of London, in the book The Nature and Origin of the Biological World, said this: at the present stage of geological research, we have to admit there is nothing in the geological records that runs contrary to the view of conservative creationists. This is an evolutionist saying this. That God created each species separately, presumably from the dust of the earth. And he's admitting that from the present evidence, there's nothing to argue against that. Now, the tremendous weight of evidence which the real guys out there know about, which is demonstrated by all these quotes I'm giving you, the result is that many scientists are actually losing faith in evolution. And some are becoming creationists, even though not all of them are becoming Christians. There are people, scientists, well-known scientists, who have actually given up evolution and become creationists. But they're not creationists as in biblical creationists. They don't necessarily believe the Bible as such, and they don't believe in Jesus Christ. They haven't come to saving faith, though some of them have, some haven't. But they're becoming creationists, which means that they believe that it had to have been created by somebody up there somewhere, somehow created and not evolved.
And they believe young Earth.
Now, some do. Some of them do, who are not Christians, but not all of them. They just believe that it was all created sometime. So there's a wide range of these people. Some are becoming believers and accepting strict and creation as we know it. Some are not becoming believers and are holding to a young earth with a young creation. Others are still holding to great ages, but that it was all created and no evolution. So it's a variety. And there's others who are not becoming creationists, but they're utterly disillusioned with the evidence.
Would the ones that is there any evidence that there's a kind of a New Age twist to this, as far as involvement with God?
I have not encountered that. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't. With the New Age being what it is, there may well be something in there. I don't know. But I have not read the kind of sources that get into anything New Age, so I don't know. And I frankly, about all I ever read about New Age are what some of the guys that expose New Age are revealing, and most of that stuff isn't. I've never read any of it that touches on creation. So I'm simply ignorant of what that may be. Here's a quote again from Sunderland, who says, hundreds of scientists who once taught their university students that the bottom line on origins had finally been figured out and settled are today confessing that they were completely wrong. They've discovered that their previous conclusions, once held so fervently, were based on very fragile evidences and suppositions which have since been refuted by new discoveries. Not that, by the way, that they ever had any evidence in the first place, but the new discoveries have so utterly refuted their belief system that they've been honest enough to just give it up. A number of formerly ardent evolutionists, guys that were really into it, have accepted part of all of the concept of creationism, as we were saying a minute ago. Here's an example of one. I quoted him earlier in the beginning of this evening. Biologist and paleontologist Gary Parker used to be a dyed-in-the-wool, aggressive evolutionist, has become a creationist, and he said this. This is a quote from the film The Origin of the Species, which is a creationist motion picture put out by two guys named Glashower and Paul Taylor, William Glashower and Paul Taylor. He said in the film this: in most people's minds, fossils and evolution go hand in hand. In reality, fossils are a great embarrassment to evolutionary theory and offer strong support for the concept of creation. If evolution were true, we should find literally millions of fossils that show how one kind of life slowly and gradually changed into another kind of life. But missing links are the trade secret, in a sense, of paleontology. Trade secret. Paleontologists don't talk about it with the public, but missing links are the problem. The point is, the links are still missing. What we really find are gaps that sharpen up the boundaries between kinds. In other words, the more evidence they find, the sharper the distinctions between the life forms become. It's those gaps which provide us with the evidence of creation of separate kinds. As a matter of fact, there are gaps between each of the major kinds of plants and animals. Transition forms are missing by the millions. What we do find are separate and complex kinds pointing to creation. And then Stephen Gould, who still continues to be an evolutionist, but nevertheless admits some of these things, says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Okay? So, what in fact does the fossil record actually show? One, that fossils by the billions are evidence of the fact that billions of animals and plants have lived and died on the Earth over whatever span of time we're talking about. We're talking, of course, about 6,000 years of total time. They're talking about millions and billions of years, but whatever. There have been billions of plants and animals living on Earth. The fossil record shows that. There's no question about that. The fossils reveal that some varieties and types have become extinct. In other words, they find fossil forms of life that appear to no longer exist today. Now, again, we talked before about living fossils, like these fish and other creatures which they've found in the fossil record that they said went extinct 100 million years ago, to pick one particular example, 100 million years ago, and yet they come up, they fishing trawler pulls one up, and back, what was the name of that one again? The coelacanth. Back in 1961, they pulled up this living fossil, dead for supposedly 100 million years. Now they've not only caught one, but they've caught all kinds of them now. They're plentiful off the west coast of Africa. It's just that nobody ever noticed before. Probably they'd even been caught before, and the people that were catching them didn't know or care. It's an ugly thing, by the way. They probably just tossed it back in. It's one of the ugliest fish I've ever seen in my life, the coelacanth. and I can see why somebody finding a fossil of it might easily interpret it as some early life form, because it's one of these ugly things like they draw pictures of in the books,
When did they find them?
Pardon me?
When did you say they found them?
The real one, the living one, you mean?
Yeah.
1961, I believe. Mm-hmm.
They probably still have them listed in the history books.
Probably.
Maybe it died 100 million years ago because of the salt in the water.
It was preserved, yeah.
Evolved.
Anyway, so there are some that claim they're extinct which aren't. I don't believe that dinosaurs are extinct. I believe there's still living dinosaurs on Earth. They're just not as big as they used to be. And I believe if those who had a vested interest in creation, see, the evolutionists have a vested interest in not finding living dinosaurs. So they're not doing research to find living dinosaurs, the evolutionists. But if somebody had the funds to finance a creationist expedition, which would cost millions of dollars to do it, I believe if we went out, we could find actual living and bring back living examples of dinosaurs today. But nevertheless, I'm not arguing, and no creationists is arguing with, that there aren't extinct forms. There are creatures that there's no evidence that they're still living today, that have become extinct. So the fossil record indicates some varieties and types that have become extinct. The Earth is becoming more impoverished of the great variety of plants and animals that used to exist. The fossil record is clearly indicating that. We have less life forms now and less variety now than we had supposedly hundreds of millions of years ago. Okay? Now that's odd in that, if evolution's true, we should have more variety now, not less. In fact, how do their trees work when you look at their trees of evolution? It starts off with one life form down here and evolves into more and more variety of life forms. So today we should have more life forms, not less, if evolution's true. But it doesn't work that way. So what I'm saying is, what does the fossil record actually show? It shows that we're going downhill in terms of variety and not uphill, not increasing variety. Now, what's really interesting is that most fossils are not of extinct animals. Most fossils are, in fact, very similar to or totally identical to creatures that are living today. There are many more living species of animals that is, they're still living today that are found on the fossil record than there are of that are known only as fossils. Evolutionist William H. Matthews. Earlier I quoted a guy named William Matthew. That's not the same as William H. Matthews. This is a different guy, but they're both evolutionists. But in his book Fossils, he supplied figures which indicate that less than 10% of all the species that ever existed, in terms of the evidence we have, are known only as fossils. And 90% are living. In other words, 90% of the things found in the fossil record are still living today. And therefore, to answer the question that you asked before about how many are there, he pointed out there's approximately 1,105,000 living species of animals today, and only about 130,000 extinct species discovered thus far. Okay? Now, by the way, I don't know about, when they say this many species, I'm not sure how many of those species might really not be, by definition, really species, but varieties within a species. I don't know how they count that stuff. Because sometimes things will be labeled as a different species when really it's something that is capable of reproducing with another in the same general family, And I don't...
Definition of a species?
Well, that's what I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of vagueness about the use of the term. Okay? Creationists use a different term rather than species. And I've forgotten what the term is, Barrowman or something like that is the term they use. And it goes back to the biblical forms that are talked about, when the Bible talks about God created kinds. All right? So it may be that the kinds may be a lower number. And that for example, on the ark, he would only have to take a pair of a particular kind that now could have, in its variety, as the genetic variety would work itself out, they might be defining as many more species. But really all relates to a single kind. And so the ark might not have had to have all those different supposed species on the ark. But I don't frankly know enough about that to say any more than I just have. They'll let you know that there might indeed be a difference between kinds that can become these different species in the sense of variety through the genetic code that God built into the original kind versus more defined and more finely tuned species.
Evolutionists would never use the term kind.
No, I don't think so. They would certainly not do it intentionally. It might sound too much like the Bible. So again, if evolution were true, one wonders why the case is not the exact opposite of what we just described. Why are not there millions of times more extinct types found than living species? In other words, we should have with the whole process of evolution, there should be much more in the fossil record. But we should, on the other side, we should have tremendous variety here too that wouldn't be existent in the earlier layers, supposedly earlier layers. But again, all the layers have tremendous variety in them. They just don't talk about those. In the books, they put the layers where they have only the supposed simple life forms. Many of you I know have heard of Duane Gish, who is a creationist scientist from ICR, Institute for Creation Research, and he's probably the foremost creationist debater in the world. And he's done more debating than any of them. Personally, I prefer Henry Morris to listen to him as a debater. I enjoy him more. But Gish has had just an infinite amount of, infinitely more experience than any of them in debating evolution. But he's debated a large number of well-informed evolutionists, that is, evolutionists who knew their stuff, on these various points regarding the fossil record. And he's concluded the following, quote, that the fossil record is often cited by evolutionists, although it's often cited by evolutionists as support for the theory of evolution, actually the fossil record is an embarrassment to the theory of evolution. He says it provides support for the concept of direct special creation. Which, by the way, is why, if you could listen to all the different debates these guys have been in, most of the debating that goes on, the evolutionist doesn't spend a lot of time debating the hard evidence. He spends most of his time accusing the creationists of being religious and non-scientific. and they get totally philosophical in their arguments, and they're not willing to discuss, usually not willing to discuss the science. By the way, just for the background, by the way, that quote came from the book, The Fossil Record, the film, The Fossil Record, and was a quote from Gish in that film. But his background, let me tell you who he is. He's a creationist, a biochemist, a lecturer, PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley, a research associate, research division of the Upjohn Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan, from 1960 to 1971, assistant research associate in biochemistry, University of California, Berkeley, the Virus Laboratory, 1956 to 1960, assistant professor of biochemistry, Cornell University Medical College, New York City, 1955 to 1956, Lilly postdoctoral fellow, Cornell University Medical College, 1953 to 55, Phi Beta Kappa, University of California, Los Angeles, vice president of the Institute for Creation Research and foremost debater on creation evolution. Guy has a lot of credentials, but guess what? What do the evolutionists, such as our friend that came the first night, say about guys like Gish? They say they're phonies and they're liars and deceivers that made up their credentials. Because the point is, this evolutionist says he knows evolution to be true. These guys won't believe it, therefore they're liars and deceivers, therefore they make up their credentials.
Credentials?
Yeah, it's a farce to say such a thing.
But I was going to say, though, it's his credentials, if I wouldn't have known he was a creationist or, any connection as far as a Christian, Berkeley.
Yeah.
John?
Well, he probably wasn't always a creationist.
I know that.
Yeah, okay.
Saying that. His credentials would be appealing to the world.
Okay, if the creation model is correct, and I'm using that in the first class conditional clause form, if the creation model is correct, and of course it is, according to its predictions, the fossil record should, 1, begin with abrupt appearance of very complex life forms, and 2, be void of any evidence of evolutionary ancestors for each basic type of animal and plant. That's what our model predicts regarding the fossil record. What have we found through all of this boring stuff? I know it's boring to hear a bunch of quotes, but what have we found? We found that the evidence totally agrees exceedingly well with the predictions of the creationist model, and it's based on observation of both the creationists and the evolutionists. Both agree the evidence supports the creation model. Now, I don't mean that all evolutionists agree, but I've given you a number of quotes from a number of different evolutionists that admit the evidence in the fossil record really supports creationism, and that's why they better not be using it. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. I want to just quickly get into, and probably we'll have to finish this next time. How did most animals and plants become fossilized? What, in fact, is the process of fossilization? There's no evidence of gradual fossilization occurring today as the geologists and evolutionists say that it happened in the past. What is the picture they portray? They portray evolution happening gradually and slowly over eons of time, but that the fossil record is these various life forms dying and gradually and slowly being buried over millions of years as these layers pile up gradually and slowly.
What do they say? 1 inch of dirt every 1,000 years?
Something like that. About an inch per 1,000 years of the layers forming.
Where's all this dirt coming from all around?
Well, that's a good question. Where does it all come from? Well, some say, well, it blows from other parts. It blows from one part of the earth to another part and buries something. Well, and if that's true, then eventually the part that got buried should get blown away over to someplace else and should be uncovered. In fact, in reality, there's no observation that would cause us to believe that these layers are gradually building up over years. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And that's the whole point. We need to discuss this whole process of fossilization. Fossilization, in fact, as known today, is a rare and an unusual occurrence. It's not happening in any proportion like the fossil record would indicate. The fossil record is this vast, humongous amounts of evidences of dead creatures. Many times in mass graves where you've got thousands, millions of creatures in a single place all at once. We don't see that happening today. It's very rare at all. Any kind of fossilization is rare. It's not, in fact, an everyday event. According to the best evidence, animals and plants cannot become fossils unless they're buried quickly and deeply in the right kind of materials. I mean, for example, if you go out in the backyard and bury a dead squirrel, does it get fossilized? No. It gets eaten up, at least by the bacteria. And even the bones will eventually turn to dust in most cases. They don't turn into fossils, just burying them under dirt. Here's a quote from Doctors Henry Morris and John C. Whitcomb, co-authors of the book The Genesis Flood, published in 1961, I believe it was. Regarding the fossilization process, they said this: a carcass left exposed after death is almost sure to be torn apart or devoured by carnivores or other scavengers, and if it escapes these larger enemies, bacteria ensure the decay of all but the hard parts, and even they, the bones, crumble to dust after a few years if exposed to the weather. If buried under moist sediment or standing water, however, weathering is prevented, decay is greatly reduced, and scavengers cannot disturb the remains. For these reasons, burial soon after death is the most important condition favoring preservation. Waterborne sediments are so much more widely distributed than all other kinds that they include the greater majority of all fossils. Flooded streams drown and bury their victims in the shifting channel sands or in the muds of the valley floor, unquote. So that describes the reality of fossilization occurring basically as a result of being buried due to flood. Pardon me? Yeah, the evolutionists have to think that all these animals are just plain numb, you know. But there's one other kind of condition that's when say it's rarely anything but water sediment type remains. The La Brea tar pits out in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area, they found these tar pits full of fossilized creatures that fell into a tar pit and sunk into a tar pit. Well,
will they become stone in there? Is that
well, what they're finding is preserved bones. That's what they're finding.
That's fossilized?
Yeah. Anyway, fossilization experiments in the sediment-rich Mississippi River Delta, you know, where the Mississippi River ends up down in the south, in that region show that it takes far greater than normal sedimentation to prevent the total disintegration of fish by bacteria and scavengers. In other words, even there where there's sediment being laid down continually, they're still not being fossilized. That kind of water sediment is inadequate. They have much greater quantities to actually fossilize that. That is something that was researched and published by two different evolutionists in an article called the Paleoecological History of Two Pennsylvania Black Shales. And Luther Sunderland also reports about that in his book Darwin's Enigma. Okay, let's see here. Let me just make another comment and then we'll cut it off and finish this discussion of fossilization next week. Usually an animal or plant that dies in the forest doesn't become a fossil. And in fact, the average creature that dies in the sea or a lake doesn't become a fossil. Under most conditions, the dead creature floats or disintegrates, and the body is destroyed by predators, bacteria, and the elements. That's almost always, in the vast majority, and probably, in fact, you'd have a hard time going out and deliberately finding something that's actually being fossilized that died. So, you know, where did they all come from?
Where do those fossilized forests come from?
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, we're out of time. Next week, on Thursday night next week, we'll pick up our further discussion of the fossil record. And I think it could end up being 2 more weeks because we're going to have quite a discussion about the so-called fossil men, the cavemen, the transitional life forms between apes and man, supposedly. We'll be talking about that as well during the next week or two. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank and praise you for again what you've shown us tonight, and that indeed even the fossil record, the result and evidence, we believe, Lord, of the flood which you brought about in Noah's day, speaks entirely and conclusively in favor of your biblical account of creation and the flood, rather than any form of evolution. We thank you for the evidence, for all the arguments, even the admissions